Good morning, everyone. His Excellency Pasquale Terracciano, the Ambassador of Italy to the UK, distinguished panelists, dear students and guests, both here with us and connected digitally through our live streaming. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Italian Society at the LSE, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural edition of the Italian Forum, Rethinking Italy at a Global Level. I must admit that when we were developing the theme of this forum, we could not fully envisage the turn of events that in these last months have brought Italy back to the center stage of international relations and have made this forum and rethinking Italy at a global level so topical. We had started brainstorming ideas when there was the Italian presidency of the EU. Then came the appointment of Mogherini as High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. And in these weeks, the discussions on the need for an intervention in Libya have again moved Italy to a prominent role on the front line of the political and diplomatic arena, both at the European and the international level. However, the concept around which we organized the Italian Forum derives from a more long-term reflection, and that is the understanding that despite Italy's strategic position in Europe and the Mediterranean, its international and foreign policy role have often remained in the shadows. Through various keynote speakers and panels, this conference will thus try to provide an overview of Italy's efforts in three main realms: international aid and development, defense and security policy, and Italy's leadership ability in Europe. The topics chosen reflect three traditional pillars around which foreign policy has developed after World War II: multilateralism, Atlantism, and Europeism. Discussion of these issues remains, except for some rare exceptions, completely absent from the public debate, while in our opinion it needs a profound rethinking given the completely new and complex global setting in which we currently operate. The LSE, with its truly international character, offers a unique platform to make a significant contribution to such global debate, in which we invite all participants of this forum throughout these 2 days to actively contribute. It is not my intention to provide any lesson in foreign policy. It is not my realm of expertise, and you will benefit from speakers that are much more entitled than I am in these 2 days. But I would like to highlight two elements, probably trivial, but which I consider when I was reflecting on the theme of our forum. The first one is at a more European level, and the other concerns is that the Italian arena in particular. At a time when the European project is being challenged by one of the most severe recessions in the last decades, we have to understand that if we want to establish a new narrative, our analysis of a new architecture for Europe cannot continue to take into consideration only mere economic factors, void of any geopolitical considerations. Take the discussions on Greece. Its economic relevance is probably limited compared to other giants in Europe, but we must not forget its location. The Hercules pillars to one of the borders that will matter the most for Europe in the coming years. So we can all imagine what losing this country would mean. So if we don't start zooming out in our analysis, if we will continue to enlarge the list of those countries that have decided to start looking inward, and these, of course, will have severe backlashes. Jean Monnet is remembered by Mario Draghi during his speech in Naples last October, affirmed that we should not sit down on opposite sides of the table as adversaries. We should all sit down as partners on the same side of the table, with our challenges on the other side of the table. The European table is not a negotiating table where each country, each institution brings its own problems. It ought to be a family table where we all come together in the pursuit of a solution to our common problem. The second element that I will briefly highlight is the importance of institutions. I think no one better than President Emeritus Napolitano has showed in these last years through his code of conduct what it means to act in the name of an institution and having respect for it. In Italy, there is often a perceived conception of the term accountability, and I'm not referring only to politicians, that is applicable also to the average citizens, to all of us. While any victory is soon appropriated by the individual, any mistake remains without name, or we point fingers at the institution. This leads to a vicious cycle in which a deterioration of our institutional system leads to a lack of trust in the citizens. This can only be broken down by an authoritative call to action, to jointly reprove a passive acceptance of reality. So knowledge of the world, together with an understanding of the fundamental ethical and rational principles, should guide our actions. Now, the digital diplomacy platform that we try to build with this forum aims to bring together an audience which listens, engages and interacts from different corners of the world. Besides the LSE and the Student Union, this was made possible only through the generosity of the LSE Annual Fund, who has selected our project in their annual competition and supported financially the Italian Forum. Also, a special thanks goes to Algebra's investment, which has renewed its support also for this academic year. As part of our intent to involve as many students globally as possible, we have teamed up with a series of important partners for this initiative, which scattered around the world are already watching us or will join us later. It is therefore in order to thank the Milmoon Association, which has organized the streaming at Bocconi University, the Italian Club at Columbia Business School, the Euro Club at Harvard University, Luis Alumni in London and Rome, and finally the Emion Academy for several other universities such as Bologna and Salerno. I would like to thank all the speakers who have accepted our invitation. In particular, I would like to thank all the panelists who have agreed to travel on their own budgets on many occasions, flying in from Italy and from other countries. Thank you. These let us open the conference for a much wider audience, making the forum completely free for all the participants. Finally, I would like to thank the rest of the student team who has worked with me on this forum, from logistics to academics, to catering and many more: Guido, Giancarlo, Matteo, Giacomo, Giulia, Alberto, and Francesca. I really hope this forum will provide some understanding for the opportunities and the threats we're going to face in the coming months and years. And I wish that for the next edition, Italy will be able to discuss how it has stepped up its ambition and together with the other European partners has started to tackle the new challenges by acting as a more united front. So without further ado, it is now my honor to yield the floor to His Excellency Pasquale Terracciano, Ambassador of Italy to the UK. Thank you very much.
È qui? Mettiamo fuori. Sì. Well, ladies and gentlemen, is it working? C'è un rumore di fondo. Su. Okay then. Well, while thinking or rethinking Italy at a global level, we have to consider how changed the security challenges facing Italy and Europe are. In nearly 34 years in the Italian diplomatic service, I've seldom registered such an array of threats to our own stability and our own security. There are new threats that are not just geographically closer to us, they are also asymmetrical, and this pose a serious threat also because we have to adapt our tools to tackle such threats. So are we facing an era of global disorder? To some extent, my answer is yes. In post-World War II, we experienced two distinct phases. In the first phase, order was based on the confrontation between the two superpowers, the so-called balance of terror. In the second phase, during the 90s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we experienced the illusion of a world order ensured through US omnipotence and through a kind of new Belle Époque of capitalism. At the end of the history, the world seemed to be flat. Two new falls, that of the Twin Towers and then later on that of the Lehman Brothers and some subsequent financial crisis, introduced us to the new century. In this new century, we are not changing. Italy is still guided in its foreign policy by the 4 traditional key pillars: European Union, NATO, openness to economic exchange, and commitment to dialogue, particularly in a multilateral framework. These pillars constitute our compass since the 50s. The problem is that we are moving from shallow waters to a real ocean, and a very stormy one, for that matter. As to the European Union, while Italy, one of the big founding nations, does remain second to none in its pro-European stance, it is equally clear that we want to spend all our energy on a different Europe, with less bureaucracy and more growth. On NATO, we are satisfied with the evolution of the alliance, lately with the results of the recent Wales summit, but we are also aware of the growing importance of Asia for US strategy, the so-called pivot to Asia. So while European Union and NATO remain 2 of our key pillars, they can no longer be an excuse for entrusting critically our economic policy exclusively to Brussels and our security sphere exclusively to Washington. What should we do? We should give our contribution to consolidate these historical pillars, taking a more proactive and direct role in its geostrategic interest, given that we are located at the crossroad between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and at the crossroads of many new conflicts, and we also have to consider in this situation our national interest. So this means that we are not less European, we are not less Atlanticist, but we feel that at this stage, with this asymmetrical and so geographically close threats, we should give a greater contribution to shaping the line both in Brussels and at European Union level and at NATO level. Let's start from the issues raised by terrorists tainting the Mediterranean region and the Middle East. This is our main concern, given that a stable Mediterranean is a cornerstone of our national interests. Surely, as Italy demonstrated with its participation in the coalition against Daesh, military might is needed to protect and arm civilians, women and children from mass killings. We cannot stand by silently when massacres happen, while at the same time continuing to pledge on humanitarian, religious and democratic credentials. This is why Italy is contributing to the current force in Iraq, supplying weapons and ammunition, reconnaissance and air refueling planes, as well as training units on the ground. The Italian effort in Iraq is second only to the US. This is not widely known, but it's the truth. Second, I was saying, only to the US for its scope, though Italy, as you know, does not take part in airstrikes. Let me be clear. It would be plain fancy to imagine that the strife against terror could be won by military might alone. Firstly, military engagement has obvious limits. Coalition airstrikes and the land offensive of Iraqi and Kurdish forces have managed to stop the advance of Daesh and sometimes to reverse it. But it would be counterproductive to simply let Shia militias or Peshmerga fighters try to recapture entire Sunni regions and cities such as Mosul and Fallujah. The real change to be achieved is to placate the sectarian hatred and stop community infighting, in a way that we are perhaps starting to see in the work of the Al-Abadi government. The new government was formed in Baghdad. For example, Mosul was traditionally a cosmopolitan city, open to trade and outward-looking. How come some of its inhabitants prefer to welcome Daesh, if not as a way of gaining some respite and protection against the discriminatory policies of the previous al-Maliki government of Iraq. This is why last month in London, in the meeting of the nations more committed in the anti-Daesh coalition, the Italian Foreign Minister Gentiloni strongly encouraged the Iraqi Prime Minister al-Abadi to continue with his inclusive policy. Inclusiveness is a more effective weapon than dozens of brigades of Iraqi official army. This, I believe, is the key issue. When people talk of the unrest sweeping through Muslim countries, we should focus on how these tensions and turbulences are the settlings of all scores within the Muslim world. We witnessed this dynamic in Iraq, but also in Syria, where a civil war has led to hundreds of thousands of deaths and an enduring humanitarian crisis involving millions of refugees in the past few years alone. We can also see tensions and clashes in Yemen and Nigeria, and not forget Somalia. Most of the times, these tensions and clashes are not between secular and religious attitudes, but between men of peace and intolerant fanatics. What fanatics and terrorists share at any latitude is their inability to accept the equal dignity of women and their opposition against minorities. What is at stake is the choice between an open society that respects women and is inclusive of minorities and a closed society, extreme and violent, based on the banishment of what is different. The same approach, aiming to achieve a political solution, national unity and halt all fighting, is what should guide us in our policy towards Syria. I think that Europe can contribute to this political process, building on the successful peacekeeping missions in the Balkans. Who could have thought some years ago that a renewed dialogue between Serbians and Kosovars would bring back together two people that have been separated by rivers of blood? It happened, and it's a European accomplishment that could be duplicated elsewhere. The same urge to put weapons aside and start peace talks sums up Italy's effort in Libya. For Italy, Libya is a top priority given its geographical proximity, our economic interests, and because of the cultural and historical links that tie the two countries. Not to mention the security threat that a failed state next to Sicily would pose, and already poses, to Italy and to the whole of Europe. In Libya, we support the work of the UN Special Envoy because of our belief that there is no alternative to a negotiated settlement. And we do hope that in the next few days, this was a Freudian slip, I'm afraid, the next few days, these attempts to negotiate a settlement can make at least some steps in the right direction. However, there is a sense of urgency to achieve a political solution. That is why Italy is stressing the need for stepping up the diplomatic efforts of the international community. Libya is very important for us in terms of energy supplies, gas and oil, but even more critical is the fact that the country is incredibly close to us, just a few hours by sea. With a coastline of 8,000 kilometers, Italy is highly exposed to those criminal gangs exploiting migrants, trafficking in human beings. The lack of any serious control of the Libyan seashores caused by internal fighting has made them a privileged point of departure for desperate clandestine migrants and asylum seekers from war-torn areas. 140,000 migrants reached our coasts only from Libya in 2014. As you know, we launched a national humanitarian rescue operation called Mare Nostrum immediately after the Lampedusa tragedy in 2013, and we were confident that Europe would have soon backed our efforts. Unfortunately, this took more time than expected, and now we have a too small scale replacement at European level, Operation Triton, patrolling our southern maritime borders. obviously, our foreign policy challenges aren't limited to the Middle East and to the Mediterranean, the two areas of most important strategic interest of Italy. We also have Ukraine, the crisis between Ukraine and Russia now. In Ukraine, the conflict brought us back to the bleak times when civil wars were being fought on European soil. I believe that if Europe had been less bureaucratic and more attentive in its dealings with the integration of Ukraine in the European Union, for example, reassuring Russia and stressing how the process would have been in the Russian interest too, this conflict could have been avoided altogether. But now the conflict is there, and let me be clear, acts like bombing of civilians are unacceptable and utterly incompatible with our values. So first of all, Moscow needs to show responsibility and restrain, stop destabilizing Ukraine. But the prerequisites for a solution, luckily, are already there. The enforcing of the Minsk agreements would be a first step, but then both parties need a willingness to engage to reach a lasting agreement. But in this conflict, European identity too is at stake. Let's be honest, either as a continent we shall succeed through economic pressure to obtain a negotiated settlement, or we should be ready to countenance the prospect not of a frozen conflict, but of a prolonged, low-intensity clash that may at some point degenerate into a return to the opposing blocs mentality between the West and Russia. Italy doesn't want this. Therefore, to avoid such a scenario, we Europeans need to be clear, first with ourselves and then with the Russians, on our strategy, on our red lines, and on our scope for a compromise, letting open the door of dialogue. And let us remember that mediation is a key feature of diplomacy. It makes us stronger and not weaker. I tried to give you a short overview of our foreign security challenges from an Italian perspective. This is an age of upheaval and daunting challenges for Italy and Europe, but I am confident that we may succeed in tackling them by building our diplomatic actions upon the strong pillars of our consolidated lines of foreign policy and on the values that have allowed us to overcome so many crises in the recent past. And let me conclude with a personal thought. I think that in this phase that, as I said, we have to tackle so different threats to our stability and security, we should really go back to the roots of diplomacy and try to avoid to transform the sacrosanct public diplomacy, which is needed nowadays in a democratic society, into a loudspeaker diplomacy, where then the effect of the announcement cancel all the potentiality of a real compromise. This is probably less easy to sell to public opinion. The soundbite is obviously much easier to sell, but in the end it's not in the interest of the general public, because it's not conducive to a possibility of a political settlement, of a political negotiation that could restore some stability for our times. Thank you very much.